Alright. Hello, good evening. I'm Gokul. I recently joined Archives at NCBS. I am working towards creating public engagement programs at the Archives. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the 71st edition of Archives Public Lecture Series. As some of you would have already participated in these lecture series before, or you might have already heard of the space Archives at NCBS. So we are a public collecting center for the history of science in contemporary India. So we house around 400,000 processed papers, photographs, recordings and more. And we are situated at the basement of this particular building where we are right now. And you can also find us online at archives.ncbs.res.in. Currently, we have the public lecture series that's going to happen right now. So it's basically a talk series by individuals based on their vast body of work and service. These talks are framed around their explorations in and around the archives and more broadly around the history of ideas. The series has included discussions by artists, archivists, academicians, lawyers, teachers, journalists, and more. For this lecture, the 71st of the series, we are very delighted to have Amrita Shah with us to give the talk. So Amrita Shah, she's a former editor at Elle and Debonair, is also an ex-contributing editor with the Indian Express and has worked for the US-based Time Life News Service. She has been the fellow of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, the Research Institute Advanced D. Nantes, and the Center for Contemporary Studies at the Indian Institute of Science. She is also a recipient of the Fulbright, the Homi Bhabha, and the New India Foundation Fellowships. She is also the author of multiple books, including Vikram Sarabhai Alive, Ahmedabad, A City in the World, and many more. The talk today is titled Between the Real and the Record, Building Stories from the Archives. In this talk, Amrita will reflect on 3 decades of diving into archives towards telling stories from media, science, urban societies, and personal histories. And I will just let her continue with her talk.
Thank you Gokul. Thank you Venkat very much for inviting me here and everyone at the Archives for being so wonderful. And thank you also for inviting me to talk about my research process, which is something that one rarely gets to talk about. You know, the content is there in the books and one endlessly talks about that, but the research process is something that I don't often get a chance to do. So I am delighted to be here talking about this. So today I'm going to talk about the archive in the context of literary non-fiction with reference to my own works. And so before I start, I should kind of explain what it is that I do, because literary non-fiction or creative non-fiction, as it is sometimes called, is not very well known outside of writerly circles, and even there it's sort of got limited understanding. So, and it's a term also that keeps evolving. So I'm going to try and briefly define it. In that most of you would be familiar with popular non-fiction. I mean, which would be just books that are based on fact, but you read them for information and pleasure. They're not textbooks or academic works, unless there is a crossover and they are popular works. Now, literary non-fiction is a segment of popular non-fiction in that it pays attention to content and to style. And by that I don't mean, popular non-fiction can also be extremely well written and pay attention to style, but literary non-fiction takes experimentation, it can experiment with form and structure and do things, use, for instance, literary techniques, borrow them from fiction, from poetry, from other forms, from drama. It can use plot, dialogue. Again, it's something that can be used very badly and of course very well. But the point is that it requires a lot of research, because you're doing research not only to get the content and the arguments in your book, but also style. You can't take these sort of stylistic leaps without a lot of data. So, so research is really, really central to this whole process. And so the question is, how do you go about collecting this data. A literary non-fiction writer's approach to research is not prescribed. There are of course ethical constraints and conventions about verification and certain kind of procedures that you follow about cross-checking and things like that. But she is not constrained by disciplinary requirements as an academic or a scientist might be. She can literally look anywhere in any manner for information. And because there is a great deal of freedom implied, each person will also follow her own individual path to collecting data. So then the archive, the idea of the archive for a literary non-fiction writer is a very fluid concept. The way we understand archives is usually as a sort of space where you have a collection, a formal space with a collection of documents. Even if you sort of broaden that term out to include family archives and smaller sort of informal archives, there is a certain element of formality and cataloging and so on and so forth. But in my understanding of the archive and in my own work, with literary non-fiction you can actually create your own archive. You can be quite imaginative and different things. It doesn't even have to be a space. Different things get called an archive. So I hope this will become clearer as I talk about each book. So the way I've organized my talk is that I'm going to talk briefly about the first 3 books, and I'm not going to talk about everything I did for each book in terms of research, but I'm going to, I picked out one element in each book that represents an archive, and at least in my kind of conception. So in the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk in a little more detail about my latest book, because there I have actually made extensive use of formal archives, and I want to kind of show how I used the findings in the archives over there. So that will be the second part. So to begin with, I will talk about the first book. So this book was called Hype, Hypocrisy and Television in Urban India. It came out in 1997 and it was republished in 2019. It was called Teleguillotine, How Television Changed India. Now this was a book about how the electronic media revolution was transforming India. Today we of course know this, there are studies and books and films, but in 1987 I was looking for material to propose a story to an international magazine on the subject, and I found absolutely nothing. I found no scholarly work, no sort of empirical work. There seemed to be actually no attention being paid to that, except by journalists, who were doing articles. And I was fascinated by this whole revolution, the whole technological revolution that was taking place and its socio-cultural impact. So I was writing a lot of articles, but I could not find anything to back my proposal. So I started thinking about doing a book myself, and my idea, of course, at that time I was a journalist, and so what I could think of doing was traveling to towns and cities and doing interviews, basically to write a journalistic study of the phenomenon. But before I did that, I had to get perspective and context. I couldn't just go off. I had to have some sort of framework, at least to begin with, to ground myself, just to start with. And there was, of course, no internet, no Google at that time. For my stories, I used to do background research in documentation centers in those days, which were sometimes attached to newspapers. But I also used to keep my own library of newspaper clippings. So I had about 15 to 20 box files about this size. I would collect things according to my interests or whatever I felt was important at that time. So states like Punjab and Assam, which were very much in the news, political parties, business and socio-cultural trends, things like youth surveys, consumerism, social aspirations. So whatever I thought might be of interest, I would cut and keep, not knowing when and where I would use that. And when I started thinking of this book, this sort of my personal archive of clippings was what provided the framework and the foundation for me to kind of build on. They told me what was going on in the country and in the world and what the scope of my book could be. I mean, of course, I was free to reject that later on, but it allowed me to start. And this is a list of the contents. Not all of them are sort of clear, But and then these are a few photographs, an extract I found, and many of you might not even recognize Rajni, for instance, which was a very popular television serial about consumerism. Fighting, it was a kind of middle class figure, a crusader for sort of middle class justice, you could say. As you can see, there is a picture of the demolition of the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya. There is WWF, World Wrestling Federation, which had just started. You were seeing all that coming in through satellite television. I talked about MTV. I talked about how Doordarshan was shaping Rajiv Gandhi's image, how the televisation of Indira Gandhi's funeral in '84 contributed to the rise of her son as Prime Minister, the use of video by the opposition. So these were, and I also talked about consumerism and the decline of journalism, all of which was, I guess, prescient, though no one kind of at that point thought that it would happen. And so that's why I think when the book came out in 2019, that's why a publisher agreed to bring it out again. So fittingly then, for my first book, which was when I was just, I'd never sort of written a non-fiction book before, the media itself was my archive for a book on the media. Now the next book I wrote was a biography, and one that I think many of you might be familiar with. This was a book called Vikram Sarabhai, A Life. Now in a way this book was an extension of my interest in the media, because Sarabhai was influential in popularizing the idea of using television for development and the idea of satellite technology for communication. And I had read a one-page profile about Sarabhai in a book while I was researching my book on the media, and I was struck by the wide range of his activities, the many institutions he built, and the vision he had for using technology to impact the lives of the poor, and his very unusual approach to the question of nuclear weaponization. Now, for various reasons, I discovered that the numerous family, institutional and government archives that I had assumed would be available to me were actually not available. Partly, there are many reasons for it. Some of them were that we are not very good at keeping records or even perceiving the need to do so. Partly there were egos involved, partly factors like the Official Secrets Act. Also, I did not have the resources then to go to Cambridge, where Sarabhai had studied, or to MIT, where he went every year to Bruno Rossi's laboratory. So, there was a paucity of resources, but also there was sort of no access to the archives that I thought, I just assumed would be available when I started working on the book. Now, by the time I understood that this was the case, I had already been out. I think I'd spent a few months already doing the background research, going to Ahmedabad a few times, and so it didn't occur to me to back out. I just kept going on. But you cannot, you cannot write a biography just listing accomplishments, or you can't have a Wikipedia entry. That cannot be the sort of the way you write a book, and certainly not if you're a literary non-fiction writer. You have to enter into the person's life. You have to make the person come alive. You have to explore the many facets of his personality and so on. Now, I had some material. It was not like I had nothing at all. I had some of the slim hagiographical accounts that were there, which gave me the kind of bare bones structure, of the arc of his life. I had some of Sarabhai's speeches, some tributes, his PhD thesis. I had an unpublished account by a teacher who taught him when he was very young. Some more teachers' accounts, transcripts of interviews from ISRO, which were really valuable. Some papers from the Atomic Energy Commission, and I had a few other things which I'm not listing. The family photographs, and the most precious thing that I was shown very hurriedly and in this sort of cloak and dagger way. I was shown it for a couple of hours and it was taken away from me, were a few pages of Vikram Sarabhai's day planner at a certain time. So now what I did then, because I had to overcome, this is a really big hole in one's research. One assumes that you're going to get, so what I did, I combined the sparse data I had and also some very good books on the Atomic Energy Commission, one very good book on space history, sort of few sort of solid kind of books that existed, and then what I think I combined it with what I would call an archive of memories. And the archive of memories consisted of memoirs, biographies, and a very, very wide range of interviews that I conducted all across the country. And I mean, these were people, for instance, not the obvious people, not, for instance, you know, immediately one thinks of the family, and Vikram Sarabhai had many siblings and, you know, nephews and nieces who he interacted with quite a lot. Then there were, you know, there were people, his colleagues, his students, various people in the institutions that he built. So these were the kind of obvious ones, but I also kind of cast my net really wide to even get people who were had a very slight, you know, kind of connection with him. So, for instance, there was someone like Prakash Tandon, who was Unilever's first Indian head, who was involved with the Indian Institute of Management, which Sarabhai had founded, just in the initial years, and who had luckily written for me, luckily, a book called Punjabi Saga, which was his memoirs, which gave me some very interesting insights into Ahmedabad society, the milieu in which Sarabhai grew up, and of course Sarabhai and his sort of his approach to the institute and so on. Then I sort of found Nora Rossi had written a postscript in Bruno Rossi's book, where she again mentions Sarabhai coming to MIT every year at the beginning of spring. And you know, it's just a little 2 to 3 lines, but these I kind of literally mined. When you talk about mining an archive, I guess what I was mining, I was making an archive from whatever references I was getting and pulling out all these things. But now let me explain, sort of illustrate how this works with a few examples. So for example, I know that Sarabhai went to Cambridge in 1937. So here is a picture of him as a student. And I know that he went with his wife, with his brother Gautam, and this I knew. This was in the, I think, in the kind of hagiographies that I saw, but I knew nothing more, right? And as I said again, style and content. One needs data. So I was interviewing a lot of people, just anyone and everyone who I thought would have at that point had some connection with either the Sarabhai family or with Vikram himself or with someone you know around him. And the writer Khushwant Singh was one of the people I interviewed, and he told me, and again as I said, this is an unexpected revelation. He said that his wife had been on the boat with Vikram and Gautam when they were going out to Cambridge. So you know, and so he said that she remembers that how they used to call their parents every single day from the UK. Which you can imagine at that time, you know, it's a really expensive thing to do. Then I was chatting with Keku Gandhi, who's a very well-known Mumbai galleryist. And again, you know, I was just telling him that I'm doing this book. And he said, oh, he was at Cambridge at the same time as Vikram and his brother Gautam. And he said the two brothers gave great parties, though they did not drink. Then Sarabhai went back to Cambridge after the war. Again, very little information. There was some, I think one of his ex-teachers was in Britain and came to look after him when he was very ill. So I had these sort of little bits and pieces of diaries and documents. But in my reading, and as I said, I was reading very widely and around the subject, I came across a book by a physicist in New Zealand who was there at the time. And in her book, she gives a very, very vivid account of how bitterly cold that winter was in 1946. And you know, it's a very vivid description. It was one of the coldest winter in many, many years. And so again, and Vikram had been ill, which is again something I knew from talking to his sisters. And so I could make those connections. Now, these are the kind of details that are not, you could say, of great significance. But they provide a much more rounded account, and they add to the literary quality that I've been talking about. But they can also provide important insights. So a very important arc in my book is the relationship between Sarabhai and Bhabha and how they thought about the bomb. Now, I knew that the genesis of the relationship was at the IISc, where both had been stranded by World War II. And I knew that Vikram Sarabhai was doing his postgraduate research under Raman, and that they were both working with Robert Millikan, who was carrying out his balloon ascents in South India. And so I knew all this. I can just say this to you, and it doesn't become a kind of literary narrative. But it was an observation from the physicist S. Ramaseshan, who had been at IISc again with them, that gave me the tone of their relationship. So he just sort of casually was just talking, and he just said, Vikram and Baba were very different from the other scientists because they were from the West, and typically, he said, scientists came from the South, South India or East India. And so he said they were very different. They used to go every evening to the West End Hotel, to hang out with socialites or whatever. And he said, we used to just look at them like it was also different. And there was envy in the way, but we just couldn't conceive of this. And suddenly, in just that, with that one statement, I could see them in a way that I was not seeing them before, as sophisticated, privileged, and very well networked young men. And that was very useful to me to understand their sort of parallel careers as institution builders later on. I'm going to mention one last detail. I was very keen on understanding Sarabhai's thinking, again, as I said, on the nuclear question, on nuclear weaponization, particularly between 1969 and 1971, as India moved relentlessly towards a demonstration which Sarabhai was very staunchly against. Now, there is some very valuable thinking on this in the histories of the nuclear program, which gave me the background and some excellent analysis. But it was my interviews that helped me gain my most valuable insights into his mind at this time. And this was with a whole range of people. T.N. Seshan, the IAS officer who was at the AEC then, Vikram's wife and daughter, and then someone like K. Subramaniam, who was an advocate for the bomb and had many conversations with Sarabhai, including, as he told me, on a flight in the space between the first class and the economy, where they talked for hours. And so I'm just saying that these, one was able to, with this sort of wide range of interviews, to cross-check certain things. And they were not remembering, actually, they were not giving me speculation or opinions. They were coming up with very sort of specific memories, very, very kind of clear things which I could then connect with the information I had, with the data I had, and then make a kind of more three-dimensional picture. So I think that it was a sort of wide-ranging and eclectic human archive that was the archive for me with this book. Now I'm going to come to my third book, which is a book called Ahmedabad, A City in the World. This book is a political essay about India's relationship with modernity, framed through a city of Ahmedabad. It's about the socio-political and cultural implications of development, all seen through the framework of a kind of urban, I guess you could call it a biography. I see it more as an essay. And again, the data sources for this book were extensive. I use libraries, reports of inquiry commissions, books, media, brochures, advertisements, all kinds of things. But what I want to kind of just highlight here, since we're talking about, again, the archive and different ways of imagining the archive, is the fact that my advantage for this book was that I was both an insider in the city because I spoke the language and I knew my way around, I knew people there, but I was also an outsider because I didn't live there. I lived in Mumbai. My connection with Ahmedabad was professional. That's how I knew Ahmedabad, as a journalist and a writer, and so I could bring some objectivity to it. Now, I visited Ahmedabad for research, but I did my reading and writing in various places, which included Mumbai, New York, and Bangalore. So much of the book was actually written while I was a visiting fellow at the Center for Contemporary Studies at IISc. So as a writer, my challenge was to immerse myself in the city. And the way I did it was through maps. And the archive then for me, in this case that I want to kind of highlight, is a series of maps. So, oops.
button on the pointer has been pressed. Can you switch it off? Switch it off. Yeah, maybe that will help it.
Yeah. Do I do it manually?
Yeah.
Okay. I can?
No, it's not protected.
Okay.
There's a button.
Right. Oh, I should go back. Okay. So, Ahmedabad has some lovely historical maps on cloth with some embroidered. I think this is from the 17th or 18th century. But you know, it's fittingly that it's on cloth because Ahmedabad is a very well-known textile center. And if you look at this map, you see the city is built along the Sabarmati River, and it came up on the eastern side of the Sabarmati River. This is the old city that you see. And in the 19th century, when the mills came up, the mills came up also on this side of the river, and the working areas, the labor tenements also came up on this side of the river. Now, these maps are from this really excellent paper by Siddharth Ray Chaudhary, where he talks about the expansion of the city to the west of the river in the early 1900s. So you can see, I think, that now you have, this is 1917, so it's still east, and then you have it going, spreading out, you know, like a sort of, like a big block, but also spreading to the west. Now, Ahmedabad in the 20th century was the site of major caste and communal violence. So again, what I used the maps for, I sort of made a lot of copies of Google Maps, and I could kind of trace the roots of violence, and I could trace the sort of residential areas. So which were the kind of areas by caste, by community, by, you know, which were the working class areas. So I could actually understand the movement and the route through the city at the time it happened, not necessarily, you know, because the city has changed over time. So I did this a lot actually. I think I had a whole stack of maps which I had made, but I threw many of them away, and I think I just have a few left. So I took pictures of them for this talk. And then here, this is the city development plan in the 21st century. So these are again maps looking at bridges and highways and all kinds of things to then, you know, decide how the infrastructure will be built. So I just wanted to kind of show you this self-generated archive of maps, which enabled me to locate myself in Ahmedabad, you know, to provide a kind of immersive experience of the city, while retaining my objectivity and, you know, what I think the advantage was of being outside and not bogged down in the everyday sort of minutiae of the city. So these were the first 3 books and kind of concept, you know, different concepts of archives. Now coming to my latest book, which is a book called this is called The Other Mohan in Britain's Indian Ocean Empire. As the cover suggests, this is a book about history. And I'm going to talk about this a little differently, though I haven't, you know, I did not go into much detail with the earlier books. With this, I'm kind of going to present the book very briefly. I'm not going into great detail, but I want to kind of talk about the investigative process, because the form of the book is literary. As I said, it is history, it's quite obvious, it's imperial history, but its form is literary and it mixes various genres. So the genres that I've kind of combined in this are family history, travelogue, memoir and detective chase. And the research draws on scholarship and archival sources. So nothing is made up. I want to be very clear, at least that for me, when I say literary non-fiction, nothing is made up. Everything is factual or backed by scholarship, backed by references. If there is a brief place here and there where I say, I think this is what might have happened, then I tell you why I think so. And again, that I will take from the archive. So even for instance, people are not very rigorous necessarily when they do literary non-fiction. And so I at least do believe that non-fiction is non-fiction. You have to stick to facts. So for instance, even if I'm describing a train journey through a certain landscape, then I checked out, the moon was up in that day, that night 100 years ago or not. I mean, I really go into that fine detail. I don't give atmospheric descriptions which are not checked out. So yeah, so the archives I used were government archives in South Africa, Mauritius and the UK, colonial archives in Mumbai, and the archive at the Gandhi Ashram in Ahmedabad, municipal records, etc., etc. And I will talk about some of them as I go on. But what I will show in this presentation is not just what I found in the archives, but how I use those findings as building blocks in an investigation. So the other Mohan is set at the turn of the 20th century, which was an era of unprecedented global mobility. 50 million people went from Europe to the new colonies between the mid-19th century and the First World War, and varied forms of migration took Asians overseas in their wake. So this is a map of the British Empire at that time, and so this sort of, at that moment of colonization triggered off a migration, a very large-scale migration of Asians as well. Now my book looks at the movement of Indians in this modern era in the Western Indian Ocean, specifically in Mauritius and South Africa. And the means through which I enter this phenomenon is a personal story involving a search for my great-grandparents. So in brief, this is the story. I had a great-grandfather called Mohanlal Kilawala, who I was told went to South Africa as a young man, which would have been at the turn of the 20th century. We did not have a date, but it was just something that I worked out that would have been late 1900s to early 20th century. Now we did not know why he went, though some family members believe it had something to do with Gandhi being in South Africa. Now whatever the motive for Mohanlal's departure, his journey was of extreme significance for my family, because along the way he met a woman and they had a child who would grow up to be my grandmother. So simply put, I would not be here talking to you but for this journey. And again, we did not know who this woman was who gave birth to my grandmother. We do not know where she came from. We did not know her name. So this was the mystery that I set out to solve. Two questions: why did he go and who was she? Two main questions. There were others that cropped up along the way. So I began by exploring the background of Indians in South Africa. Why were they there in the first place? I think we see South Africa, the history of the Indian diaspora in South Africa through the lens of Gandhi. We know Gandhi went there, and we know why he went there, and then that becomes the framework through which we see the story. But why did he go there? Why were the Indians there at all? So they were there because Britain abolished slavery in 1834, but still needed labor for its colonies. So it devised the system of indenture, which was a form of semi-bonded labor by which 1.3 million Indians were sent overseas as contracted labor. Now, this is a graph. So these are some photographs of, this is of course the abolition announcement, and these are some photographs of people who went as indentured labor. This is a graph, a kind of chart showing you where Indian indentured workers went. As you can see, 2038, 2,38,000 to British Guyana, almost 4.5 million to Mauritius. But as I said, my focus will be on South Africa and Mauritius. So this is a map of South Africa from the late 19th century, and the southeast corner, which is where Port Natal or Durban is where was an agricultural part, and that's where the Indian indentured workers were taken to grow sugarcane mainly. And this is the picture of the first boatload of workers arriving in 1860. Now these thousands of Indians overseas needed to be fed and clothed, So you have another group of people setting out as traders and shopkeepers. Now, Indian indentured workers were drawn, so there was a yellow line which has disappeared. So they came from the eastern part of, like an eastern band stretching from north to south. So Bihar, the United Provinces, Bengal, Orissa, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. That's where the indentured workers went. So I guess it was where the new British tax regime, etc., had the sort of most, kind of deleterious effect. But the traders and shopkeepers, for some reason, I mean, they went from the west coast, but mainly from Gujarat, and mainly again from two places in Gujarat. So at that time, Hindus were forbidden from crossing the Kala Pani. There was a taboo, so the traffic was mainly of Muslims. And so the people who went as traders and shopkeepers were mainly Memons from Porbandar and Sunni Boras from Surat district. So this is a photograph of Kolwad village on the Tapti river, which flows from Surat. This is just outside Surat. And there was a virtual exodus from here in the late 1800s. And if you actually go there, you can see the windows are all boarded up on the top because nobody, it's like a ghost village, everyone is out. Now, the people who went on their own, non-indentured labor, were called passenger Indians because they paid their own fare. And in 1858, Queen Victoria made this proclamation: we hold ourselves bound to the natives of our Indian territories by the same obligation of duty which binds us to all our other subjects. This is a very grandiose statement which many would-be passenger Indians took as encouragement to travel. You know, they thought the empire is ours. It was a sort of new geography. So, so it kind of encouraged that sort of another sort of stream of travelers. Also, the discovery of diamonds and gold in South Africa in the late 1800s attracted a traffic from other parts of the country as well, not just Gujarat and the east that I have pointed out so far. So I found this postcard. This was in a kind of mine which is now not used any longer and has been turned into a casino. But this postcard says that these are the first Indians at a gold mine. Now, the migrants who I'm talking about so far, the passenger Indians, most of them were either illiterate or very poorly learned in, maybe in the vernacular. So they were not very kind of educated in, they were not English speaking, could not read or write English. But they worked extremely hard. They put up with all kinds of intolerable conditions, going off into the interior to exchange goods with natives where they could be attacked by wild animals, and sleeping at the backs of shops with goats and chickens, and all the things that they did. This sort of sacrifices paid off, and some of them became very successful and set up these sprawling businesses all over South Africa. So this is a picture of prominent traders in Natal, and you can see they kind of look extremely resplendent and authoritative. But another stream of passenger Indians also followed the traffic overseas, which was of professionals. Because these people, once their businesses got built, etc., they needed accountants and clerks, they needed teachers for their children, they needed, they needed all kinds of people, including religious teachers and so on. So there was another stream that followed. This is a picture of Thomas Macaulay. I'm not going to go into it. You know that he wanted to create an elite class of Indians to be interpreters and middlemen between the English and the Indian masses. And in Natal, there was actually literally a need for interpreters because, there were, as I said, indentured laborers coming from various parts of eastern India, traders coming from Gujarat, and then you have a smattering of people from the Konkan, from Punjab and all that. So you can imagine the number of languages that were spoken there and the need for people to kind of interpret languages. And so you had another stream of educated people. Some of these were missionary educated Christians, some were, now it was a mix, Hindus, Muslims, but all of them had a modicum of modern education. They could speak, read and write English. And as you can see, this is, I think, a photograph of teachers. Oops, I'm sorry, I think that's my phone. Yes, so, and in the center, I don't know if you recognize him, but the one who's not wearing a cap is Gandhi. So Gandhi was a British trained barrister who went to South Africa in 1893 as a lawyer come translator for a trader from his hometown, Porbandar. I'm sure we all know the story of how he was thrown out of a first-class train compartment in Pietermaritzburg because a white co-passenger refused to travel with him. This and many other experiences of racism turned him into a sort of political activist, and he stayed for over 2 decades fighting for the rights of the Indian migrant community. So, of course, this is the later Gandhi in India, but this is the young Gandhi who would have, this is what he looked like in South Africa. Now, okay, I'm just showing you these books, and I'll come back to why I'm showing you these books later. But my interest in Gandhi's time in South Africa, and this was sharpened by my interest in my great-grandfather Mohanlal Kilawala. Mohanlal's ancestors moved from Surat to Bombay, what was then Bombay, probably in the 19th century, with many of their fellow Surtis. Surat, the British were building Bombay, and many people were kind of migrating from Surat. Mohanlal was born in Bombay and educated in the Macaulay system. He was fluent in English, which was a rare skill in those days. And as I mentioned, he left Bombay for South Africa as a young man on a steamer that probably looked something like this. Now, as I said, I was always intrigued by this journey. Why did Mohanlal risk the caste taboo against overseas travel? Because there would be consequences, right, if you flout the caste taboo against overseas travel. And throw up the stability of a solid middle class life to just go overseas like this. And of course, who was the anonymous woman who was my great-grandmother? So I thought I would look into this puzzle someday, but how do you find traces of an ordinary man who traveled overseas over 100 years ago? My great-grandfather had left no letters, documents, stories, anecdotes, no dates, nothing. The only clue I had was a possible connection with Gandhi. Now, I did not know what to think of this because there was nothing Gandhian about Mohanlal's lifestyle that I had heard of. After he returned from South Africa, I'm told that he taught Europeans and multinationals Hindi, and that he wore a suit, smoked cigarettes, ate porridge and biscuits for breakfast. All of it, believe me, we are a fairly middle-class conservative Gujarati family, and so this is the kind of image that I had. I had no photographs of him. No one could come up with a photograph of him. So how do you find this, right? I mean, this was this mystery that I'm setting out to solve. And you know, with indentured workers, there are records because it was a formal system. So there are photographs, and there are kind of they are put in the system, and they're recorded. So you can find out where they came from, which village, etc., etc. But Mohanlal, from what I could gather, might have gone as an interpreter or a teacher or something, and he would have been a passenger Indian, of which there were no records, really. You had to look through ships lists, you had to look at arrival lists, and it was kind of, anyway, so, and I didn't even know when he went. It could have been, I really did not know what time frame also. So now, what was my advantage? I thought that, see, he was an ordinary man about whom, you know, ordinary, kind of sound person, did nothing particularly sort of famous, anything to kind of get him fame, but he went at the same time as this gentleman, about whom there is just so much. There are so many archives, there's just, you know, so much. So I thought this was my kind of the way to start, and maybe I would get somewhere. So I started by meeting a few Gandhi scholars, and then I wrote to a gentleman called Enuga Reddy, who was a much respected expert based in New York. He had a very large database on Gandhi. He used to work for the UN, and he was a collector of Gandhi sort of items and information. And I asked him if he had ever come across a reference to Mohanlal Kilawala, my great-grandfather. And as it happens, I mean, okay, he sent me a note within, I think, 2 hours. I'm only showing you the first half of the note right now. Interpreter and teacher in Natal, formerly a government servant in India. He had a passport issued to him in Mauritius in His Majesty's name, entitling him to proceed to and travel anywhere in British South Africa. Okay, the rest of the paragraph mentions the year 1908. So straight away from nothing, really nothing, I had a wealth of information. I had a time frame, so I know at least that 1908 he was in South Africa. and that he went via Mauritius, which is something that we really did not know. And I knew from this that he was a teacher and interpreter. So, as I said, this was a whole lot to build on. And the reason why Enuga Reddy had all this was, it just happened that he was working on writing a book talking about other Indians in South Africa. And because I'm not giving you the whole talk, I can't actually explain how it all connects up. But anyway, I was just very, very fortunate that all he had to do was put the name into his computer, and there it was, and he sent it to me. So now, in 2013, I had a fellowship with an overseas travel grant. And so I decided to just go on an exploratory trip to South Africa, just for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks I think. And I made a list of historians, writers, some members of Gandhi's family to meet in the places I was going. And I thought, it would all be very easy since I had this very early happy find. But once I got to Johannesburg, where I started from, I felt quite let down because, I had assumed certain things. I had assumed that the ashrams Gandhi set up in South Africa would still be functioning and there would be records and archives for me to look at, but they weren't. Both were, for separate reasons, Tolstoy Farm and Phoenix were kind of defunct at that time. One had actually been sort of invaded by, so there was a damage and stuff. Another had been turned into a brick factory, so there was nothing then. There were many memorials to Gandhi all over the country, but no records of any kind, no public records. And I assume, because I've been to the Sabarmati ashram in Ahmedabad, and I know that they have very meticulous sort of documentation and stuff. So I suddenly kind of realized this is absurd. I was not going to get anywhere. I was very disheartened, and I thought, this was a wild goose chase, and I was just going to go back. Now, one of the people I was meeting in Johannesburg was a historian called Tanisha Badasi at the Wits University. And I didn't know her. I had come across a paper which was titled Indian Interpreters in the Colony of Natal, 1880 to 1910. I mean, imagine, this was like so perfect, it fit my framework perfectly online. And I could download it, so I read it, and Mohanlal Kilawala is not mentioned anywhere. But I messaged her and I said, can we meet? And as it happened, she was in Johannesburg. She moved from Durban to Johannesburg. So I got to her office. She invited me in the afternoon, and by the time I got there, she was at her computer. And what she had done was, she had fed Mohanlal Kilawala's name into the archival system, the public archival, what was online, the search engine, which I had tried to do, but I just didn't know how to use it. There was a way to do that, which was actually quite tricky, but she was a historian. She was very skillful, of course, at handling it, and she had pulled out a whole list, there were references in archives all over the country, in Pietermaritzburg, in Pretoria, in Cape Town, and suddenly I realized that Mohanlal had left me this paper trail. So now, this is just a representative picture, to kind of. Now, I do not have time to tell you about the fascinating materials in the archives, but I will mention the basic facts I gleaned from them, which was that Mohanlal arrived in Durban from Mauritius at the end of 1905. He had a job with a white lawyer called Archibald Findlay, and Archibald Findlay had a grandson when I visited, so then I interviewed him as well. And he lived in the downtown Grey Street precinct, which is where most passenger Indians of Durban lived. So this is what it looked like then. I think this is a picture from 1900. And imagine that Gandhi is in the city at this time. He did not live here, he lived a little further off. This is the Jama Mosque, which is like the center piece, it's a landmark monument over there, the first to be built, I think. And you see the sloping roofs of the warehouses, because the grain, etc., would come to the harbour and be stored there before being kind of taken to the rest of the country. And Indians had shops below, and they lived above. That was pretty much the pattern. So as I said, Gandhi would have been in Durban at this time when this photograph was taken, but 5 years later, when Mohanlal arrived, Gandhi had moved to Johannesburg to fight in the Transvaal, as it was called then, to fight for Indian rights there. This is what Grey Street looks like now, the same precinct. So the Jama Masjid, as you can see, is expanded horizontally. And these are sort of Art Deco buildings that were built in memory of Indian traders or by Indian trader families, but they came up later. So I was looking for Mohanlal's addresses because I had taken the letters. He'd written many letters. There was a lot of correspondence between him and the authorities at various points. And I had his addresses. And he seemed to have moved a lot, but moved around just around the block. Okay, so I had 148 Queen Street was one address, so I went to 147. Anyway, I entered one of the addresses and I went up and I could see that I was literally walking around the block upstairs. So then I came, and this is a really dangerous area to wander around in, so it was quite frightening. So the first time I went alone and ran back very quickly. I literally had 100 rand in my sock and a mobile phone to call a cab. But the next time I went with a photographer who I got to know, and so then I was feeling bolder. So we walked around and then we came out. And I told him, I just started telling him we were at a traffic junction, and I said, you know what, maybe he didn't change houses so much. It seems like he changes houses constantly, from Victoria Street to Queen Street, but maybe if you look inside, you can face different streets. So maybe what he was in was a boarding house and he was just changing rooms. So the addresses were different because the streets they were facing were different. And as I said it, he's sort of thinking about it and we both look up and this is what we see. Surat Hindu Association building. So the date doesn't match, but I interviewed the Surat Hindu Association people and they said that it had started in 1907 and there could have been a kind of informal association which helped people, new migrants with, kind of accommodation and things like that. So this was, so I don't have very much time, so I'm just going to quickly just say something about my grandmother, great-grandmother. I found her name on a form in Cape Town because Mohanlal had travelled with his family from Durban to Cape Town in 1908, and so I found her name, her age, a reference to a child who was probably my grandmother, and then I continued to search for her in Durban. So this was the form that I found. I looked at maps. These are records of property in the rates office. So I looked at maps of the city at the time to try. I can't explain the whole working of, because I'm not giving you a few details about how I was thinking. But I was looking at almanacs because you also have addresses and telephone numbers there. And I was trying to match because what I did know was that Mohanlal had stayed with, he was a kind of a guest. He was staying in a certain, renting a room in a house whose daughter he married. So, that was all I knew. So I was trying to kind of locate it like this. And then I was talking to a history buff in Durban, and I was telling him my story. That was another thing I found was very advantageous, was to keep telling everyone the whole story again and again and again, because everyone was adding. Everyone would find something to kind of, from another perspective to help me. So this person just listened, and then he told me, your great-grandmother was not from South Africa, she was from Mauritius. And I don't know why, I never thought about it. Then I kind of thought about the dates on the form, her age, the fact that my grandmother was 2 years old at that time, which meant that she was already expecting a child when she left Mauritius. All these things came together, and so these are the almanacs. Sorry, this is a picture of the map with Mauritius as a little dot. Okay, I'm not going to go on, but I went to Mauritius and the story proceeds from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrita. Well, we also have an informal tea snack session after the talk is done. But if somebody wants to ask a question or two, yeah.
So this is not so much a question as a comment. Like you said, you met Krishna Singh, and it so happened that you knew something. In all such stories, there's so much that has happened that one cannot, in a sort of connections, which bring things to one's notice. And it's so unfortunate because, as I said, there's so much, right?
Right.
And it's just luck whether one gets or one doesn't get
Right.
information. Of course, always time is limited, resources are limited, but when does one get a sense that one has got a good feel for the whole thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one just knows. I think I've always known when to stop researching. And sometimes one needs to clarify some things. In fact, when I did my South Africa research, I had gone back. I finished it all in 2013. Went to Mauritius after that. I think I went to the UK. And then I was able to go back to South Africa. I wasn't expecting it. So that was a little bit of a bonus, which allowed me to cross-check some things. But I'd already, with some difficulty, I would have managed to get those references again. I don't know, I think one just knows, but in between you do start structuring, you do start figuring out how am I going to tell the story, so though if there are large gaping holes, they become apparent. But I also think, I know that it's sad that we don't have, it's so difficult to get very often access to official documents and so many things, and there are just difficulties all around. But I think sometimes it just makes you sharper and more resourceful. And I just wish that, because I hope mine is not the only, then people are then encouraged as things get easier in certain ways, that people would build on it or present a totally different perspective. One of course has to do a job of some quality. You can't just, there's no excuse for that, but
towards the beginning of your talk, you said you collect newspaper clippings and sort of use them to build your story. My question is, are newspaper clippings reliable?
They were.
They were? They're
Past
not
tense.
now.
Past tense. But I did not use it to build my story. I did not. It allowed me to kind of know the directions I could possibly pursue. And as I started doing my interviews, etc., it gave me its own path. So I did not build. Maybe I used a reference here and there, but that was not what.
Yes. These days when I read 3 newspapers every day. The same story is very different in all 3.
I would ask, why do you read 3 newspapers every day? I don't.
All right, let's meet and hope you have
Again, more a comment on that question. It seems to me that your last book was very different, not just from your previous books, but from most books describing a person. You were not trying to write the biography of a person.
No.
You were trying to do a detective work,
Yes.
find something, and you had a personal family connection to this. So these 2 things would, I think, would have made it very boring if you had all the things laid out
Right.
in one of your
Right.
requests.
Absolutely.
And you probably would not have undertaken this if it was already
Oh,
there.
absolutely.
And it was the missing information, the finding. And so I'm all for archive, I'm all for having everything laid out. But it would get a bit boring sometimes if everything is laid out
Yeah.
for you. And of course this is true when we do science. I mean, if everything is known, I know what to look for, which experiment to do and what to look for.
Yeah.
It will be boring. When we write grant applications, we are told to tell them what you are expecting. And my answer usually is, if I knew it, I wouldn't do it. So the fun is in finding out
Yeah.
unknown. So you need an optimum amount of archives, not too much.
That's a good point. I think I agree with it totally. I do think though that even if you have everything laid out, doesn't mean that you're going to tell a great story. You still have to make connections, you still have to structure it well. And I also think that you have to I know that my approach is not an academic's approach, a historian's approach, for instance, where they have a very different mandate. Mine isn't that. Mine is more to tell a story. And so I would need to add other sources. I would have to. But I agree with you. My great-grandfather was, not an important man at all. But the reason was partly personal, and of course a challenge of discovery. But I also sense that he was going to lead me to a bigger story. And he did. He led me to something that was startling, historical find that was startling, which you don't find if you're following Gandhi, because that path is known. But an ordinary man and what he was up to led me to something that is just not talked about. So that was one. And I also felt that migration, language, and the kind of post-colonial impact of language, all these, because there's a little bit of it that is also a memoir. I talk about my own writing in English and all this. So it became a larger story, which is what I think a literary non-fiction writer can do.
Thanks. So I want to just click on the literary aspect. Could you comment a little bit more about perhaps this evolution of style in your work over 30 years? Because I guess what you're saying is there are three layers to looking at memory. To say one layer is to say I found this. The second is to say this is what I think it means, which is perhaps the domain of the historical narrative. And then your third layer is to sort of then add this. This is how, in terms of form and style, this is how I wish to re-narrate what I think I found and what it means. So, is there an evolution in your own style that you can talk about, or maybe specifically in the last book that you worked on?
Yeah. So what happened was that I was very enamored of these. There's a kind of literary journalism. When you normally talk about literary journalism, you're thinking of American journalism in like the 60s, 70s. There were these writers. Basically, it came out of journalism. Now, people say that, it's been done even before and long before, and all that is true, possibly, but I'm just saying this was the kind of period in which the most sort of sparkling writing and the best known of these writers called like Tom Wolfe, Gay Talese, and the whole range of sort of sports writers. And there's another person with a very unpronounceable name who comes from outside of America, but these were Joan Didion. These were all kind of very well known. What they were doing was that they were reporting as if they were writing in a very novelistic way. Again, as I said, nothing made up, but they were like flies on the wall, and they would describe the color of the chairs, how we were sitting, and all this is not flippant or trivial. I am arguing that literary non-fiction, because it's sort of in between things, it allows you to see certain things that are not, you can't articulate in a literal way. It allows you to do that. It gives you that space of slight abstraction. But you're sticking to facts and you're discovering the truth or, whatever, facts as you go along. So these writers, Truman Capote was a very good example. He wrote this very famous book called In Cold Blood, and I'm still not sure whether they call it fact or fiction. I see nowadays they're calling it fiction or fiction of fact or something like that. But he kind of wrote brilliantly. He did these very long interviews with people. So what you do is you immerse yourself into the mind of, say, a murderer, for instance. But you also, the murder scene is alive. You can actually describe it as if you are viewing a film. So these are all techniques that were being used at that time. And this was what I was when I became a journalist, first of course I just did what one did, but I was working in a magazine. I wanted to be a writer. And this was what attracted me. I said, I want to do this. And that's, I think my media book started as some sort of attempt to do that. But then what happens is you realize that this is India. A, you don't have the resources to do the amount of research that is required, one. Two, there are many things that you're still writing something that's pioneering. In the sense that when I was doing that media study, there was no study at that time available. There was a book that came out at the same time that I wrote it, but it was a very different kind. But so you can see that we were all sort of starting off. So when you do that, it's very hard to write this kind of literary non-fiction, because for instance, they will refer to a lot of brands. I'm talking about American writers. They will refer to a lot of brands. They will make many references that are very well established in popular culture. Popular culture itself is well established, the study of it and so on. Well, here we're not. You know, it was all still starting out. So I realized I couldn't just take off and write like that. It was not, I was working and I had to introduce certain things. So for instance, had there been 5 books on Sarabhai, or even 3, and I was writing the 4th book, then I could write a very different kind of book. So these were the, I guess, constraints, but also they just told me that I couldn't do that. I had to modify what I wanted to do. So there are certain aspects of that kind of style in the media book, but I've also used a kind of more straightforward way of giving information as well. But it still reads, I would still say it's literary non-fiction, because it still reads like, well, like a thriller, I think. The Sarabhai book is a more straightforward biography. I think that is the most, there's not much experimentation there. But as I said, even then, you know, when you, the way you tell a story, the little details that you try and get. Like another example was I was talking to a friend of his son's, and I was interviewing him generally, and then I just said, what cars did the Sarabhais have? And of course he knew, and he must have played on their seats and jumped up and down and all that. So he knew the color, he knew the make, everything. So these are the things that add texture. And so I think I got better with that, you know, that book. And then Ahmedabad is really far more, I think, ambitious in terms of what I was trying to do. I think what I was trying to do was capture a certain moment in India's trajectory in a city that is historical. And I was trying to, I felt that that moment is going to disappear. And I was trying to look at the political implications and so on. It's a complicated list of things I was trying to do. But the form, I think you mentioned that I've used people. People was sort of one way of doing it. I talked about processes, I talked about the aspects of the city, whether it was the old city in the physical form of the city, the monument, the way the air went in through the shaft, and you know, things like that. I mean, just the way you see the Louis Kahn buildings, of the way the light comes on them. And so there's a lot of description that you would not find, you know, in a book that's just giving you information. So I think I got a little more exposed to other forms of, you know, writing in a literary way that was beyond the early thing that I started with, the kind of American journalism. And I think with my most recent book, I was trying to do something that was, I wanted to write an adventure book. You know, the kind of book that are written about, that empire builders write. You know, you think of Cecil Rhodes, or Cecil Rhodes didn't write books, but I'm thinking of, you know, the guy, Dr. Livingston, or stories like that are written very much in the colonial sort of, the white explorers' language and terminology, and they're read. They were very boys' books. I wanted to be a girl who wrote an adventure book, that's one. And it was about my ordinary great-grandfather, not a great person. So I think I was kind of defying the norms of colonial writing, popular writing. So that was one of the things that was playing in my mind. So this detective form and searching for clues and going on a ship. And I also pull out colonial writings and diaries and how they describe what's on the ship, and I describe me on this cheap flight going somewhere, and you know, so I try and kind of bring that correspondence. So there were lots of things going on in that book, which I think I enjoyed doing.
Alright, I would like to thank Amrita again for this talk. Thank you everyone for joining us. We also have tea and snacks outside. Before we leave, I have a quick request. So Archives is a public institution, so one of the verticals on which we work on, we operate on, is trying to make archives as a place for the public through public programming, public engagement programming. We've done a lot of different, we've experimented a lot of different kinds of public engagement programming, including the APLS, which ran for 71st time today. So we want to involve you, the public, an important stakeholder in the process of creating public engagement programming. So we've made a quick survey. So the QR code which you saw in between pop up multiple times was supposed to happen at the end. We also have it printed out outside where you'll have tea. So I would really appreciate if you can just scan the QR code and go back and do it whenever you want. Everything is optional, it's anonymous. I think it would help us a lot in creating what you think would be interesting. And thank you so much again.